Welcome to Guardians of the Directory, Chaosoft's expert podcast, exploring the complexities and best practices of Active Directory management, security, and recovery. I'm Craig Birch, identity security enthusiast and principal security engineer, focusing on identity with over 20 plus years of industry experience architecting and securing Microsoft identity solutions. As I mentioned earlier, each episode I'll examine the latest technical concerns, explore best practices, and periodically host other experts for deep dives into all things Active Directory. Well, enough about me. Let's focus on today's discussion. What if I told your Active Directory, the backbone of your organization's identity infrastructure, might already be compromised, and you wouldn't even know? Shadow permissions, DC Shadow, and DC Sync are some of the stealthiest, most destructive tactics attackers use to infiltrate and persist in AD environments. Today we're pulling back the curtain with none other than Derek Melber, a globally recognized AD security expert, to uncover how these threats work and how to stop them. But before we dive into today's topic, a quick recap of our last episode, Hack the Hallways, Cyber Threats in K-12 Education. We explored with Jason why schools are increasingly targeted by ransomware, the unique vulnerabilities in K-12 environments, and actionable steps to protect these critical institutions. Derek, can you give this audience a little bit more about your background?
Sure, not a problem. It's great to be here. Nice to see you again, Craig. My background, been around AD for a little bit. I guess we're coming up on, 25 years. I guess it was yesterday, I went out to the MVP site and registered to get my 20-year blue chip. So I've been a MVP for 20 years around Active Directory, group policy, and of course security. And in the field, have a great community that I try to help as much as possible. I've had the luxury of speaking around the world. I've spoken in about, 35 countries or so, and just really appreciate the community. Love talking about Active Directory, love helping organizations any way that I can. So it's great to be here. And you guys can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Derek Melber, and any way that I can help, I'm here to help.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, you were an expert in this area. You've been around a long time. You have been contributing to the community for years, and we appreciate that. In fact, I've learned some things from you as well. So really to kind of dig into this, I want to set the stage. So an attacker gains access to your domain controllers, and within minutes, they have full control of your organization, right? Without any alarms going off, no alerts. This isn't a science fiction. It's reality, right, of shadow permissions and DC Shadow and DC Sync. Well, we've talked about Active Directory being 25 years old. We must certainly have these things under control in today's world, right, Derek? I mean, it's been around 25 years. These organizations have this figured out. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wish we did. I really wish we did. I'm going to really go right at the jugular of what the issue is. And I'm not even going to talk about DC Sync and DC Shadow just yet. Let's talk about shadow permissions, okay? And a lot of organizations rely on their SOC, and they rely on their SIM to find issues around security. And so what the issue truly is back in the year 2002, right? Someone was studying for their MCSE, and they went into their production Active Directory, and they clicked on this thing called delegation. And they're like, heck, what does this thing do? And they went through and they're like, oh, I can set to this user or group. Oh, I can set this permission or task, right? Oh, I can allow someone to reset the password. Oh my gosh, click. Oh my God, what just happened, right? And so with 3 clicks, they did something. And they're like, well, what did I do? So they did it again in a different part to a different OU. And then they're like, well, a month later, let's do it again. And so really what they were doing is they were setting up permissions in Active Directory to give a user or a group of users the ability to perform tasks or permissions to certain objects within Active Directory. You would think that Microsoft would give you the ability to see these permissions, but they don't. And it's very difficult to see these shadow permissions, these shadow controls. And so over the years, these permissions just sat there and no one really knew about them until some hacker, some internal user decided, well, I'm going to go see who has the ability to do what. And then through lateral movement and privilege escalation, someone decided to take advantage of these shadow permissions. And voila, they leveraged them. And now someone could do something that someone could do for years. And they took advantage of these shadow permissions. And they could either modify group membership, they could reset permission, or they could reset passwords, they could create users, they could create groups, they could create computers, they could do a lot of different things. And it's very difficult to see these shadow permissions.
But it wasn't just users that created this problem as well, right? As we integrated applications in the Active Directory, things like Microsoft Exchange, connecting to Entra ID, right? These, by default, if you didn't understand how they were configured and you went with some of the default settings, they actually modified permissions within Active Directory, creating shadow permissions as themselves. One of the ones that I would always go after if I was performing a DC shadow attack, which we'll get into later, is Exchange Trusted Subsystem. That particular group has very high elevated rights at the root of Active Directory as well. So it wasn't just users that created this, even applications behind the scenes were creating these shadow permissions. And one of the things you mentioned was visibility. There's no real easy way to see all these permissions through the GUI. PowerShell's made it a little bit easier, but still, it's a challenge.
You're
So
absolutely right, Craig. You're absolutely right. And that's an excellent point. And I think, one of the things that I think everyone listening to this should do is they should go look at the groups that you have that are ancient groups that were created from these historical SharePoint, Exchange, especially the Microsoft back end services and applications that you have. And if you don't have them anymore, evaluate if you need them, right? Because a lot of Exchange, how many ridiculous groups did Exchange put in Active Directory when you installed it? And if you don't need it anymore, get rid of those things. Because not only did it put the groups in there, as Craig's saying, it really infested the Active Directory permissioning with all of these ridiculous shadow permissions. That's a great point.
another thing you mentioned was, as you know, we were studying for MCSEs back in the day. No, we're definitely aging ourselves here a little bit. But as not just as admins, we did this. But let's just say there was a project in an organization where they had to spin up some resources, had the administrator go in and delegate something for an Active Directory, and then they cleaned up and deleted that group, but they never went back in and cleaned up the ACLs. And now we often see unresolved SIDS also having these shadow permissions. You've been around for a very long time as well and been in a lot of organizations. Are you seeing that trend as well?
100%. I just did a presentation at Tech Mentor 2 weeks ago, and I had a full day presentation, kind of a workshop. And I was talking about the do's and don'ts about ACLing, right? And I said, the one thing that you absolutely don't do, whether it be a file, a folder, Active Directory permissioning, is do not put a user directly on an access control list, because you're going to orphan that entry, right? And so if you see a SID on an access control list, most likely it's because you put a user on that access control list. And sometimes it's not even you, the human, that does it. A lot of time it is going to be when you install an application, when you install a service, you're allowing that application or service to do this. It is a huge security issue. Exactly what Craig is talking about here is you're going to orphan that SID on there. So part of what you should be doing, and it's the perfect time to do it right now, around the holidays, I encourage all administrators, because we can't take off work, right? Everyone else is on holiday. We can't take off the time. Now's the time to go in and look at these things, start to do the cleanup of these things. And someone asked me, they're like, well, how do I do the cleanup? right? Because I asked someone, I said, okay, if you see an orphaned SID on an ACL, should you just delete it? And everyone's like, no, 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 right? Because we don't want to just kill something. So what you need to do, Craig mentioned PowerShell, take that SID, query Active Directory, see if that object exists in your Active Directory infrastructure. If it doesn't exist, then check to see maybe if it's on some SID history in another environment, right? Double check these things and then delete it, right? Document, take screenshots, do all those things. But you want to do cleanup of this. You absolutely want to do these cleanups because you're going to find those things all the time.
So that shadow Sid. I mean, obviously you've been doing this for a very long time. So how can that be abused in that environment? So I have this shadow Sid in the organization. The user's not there. So why is this Sid of risk to my organization? Can you maybe give me a little bit around that?
Yeah, it's not an immediate risk. It really isn't. I think it comes down to maybe a DC shadow attack. It comes to, as I mentioned, a SID history type of attack. What the attackers really want to do is they want to find these loopholes. They want to find these areas that they know are areas of attack, these risky areas that they can see that the organization aren't looking at and they're not monitoring. And it's orphaned. If I see an orphaned SID on an ACL, I know for a fact that's not being monitored. I know it. I
Right.
absolutely know it. And if I see that that SID has some privilege, I now can assume that SID's identity and no one's going to monitor me. And so if I have the ability to become that identity through a DC shadow or a DC sync or any type of if I create an identity as that, right? And I impersonate that identity, I'm golden ticket attack or whatever, however I want to do this. Now I'm in. Does that sound glorious? Does it sound sophisticated? It kind of is, but this is how the attacker wants to get into the environment. And if I have the right privilege, it actually is quite easy to do these. Some of these tools are super simple once you have the right privilege to create these environments and create these identities. And now, once I have the identity, it's super easy to move around the environment and no SIM. And I'm going to go back to this, right? No SIM is actually going to be able to monitor my behavior in such a way that a SOC analyst is going to be able to say, wow, that user shouldn't be here. And I now am determining that this is bad behavior.
Yeah, that's it's definitely a challenge, right? So I guess we've talked about shadow permissions, and they're within Active Directory, but really, I've done a lot of research, and I'm sure you have as well. There are core places in Active Directory you really want to focus on. Can you give us some insight on maybe some of the core areas of Active Directory you would want to start with? Because Active Directory is very large,
Yep.
right? And you said, hey, over the holidays, let's go check these. So why don't we give the users a couple areas where they might be able to focus immediately on trying to find and reduce these shadow admin permissions inside their organization?
Great. And I actually did this about 3 weeks ago. I always do it around the holidays, right? I always kind of tee it up right before Thanksgiving and then kind of in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? And I give a list of about 3 to 5. Go do this. So first and foremost, there is a command line option called DSACLS, DSACLS, right? It's actually built into your domain controllers through RSAT. You can get it onto your workstations, DSACLS space, and then you use the LDAP syntax for an OU, right? And what that does is it dumps the ACL of an OU, okay?
Mhm.
Go through and look for anomalous entries of an OU, right? There are 2 common entries of an OU that you want to look for. Okay. You want to look for resetting of passwords and modification of group membership. Now, Craig, you were talking about applications and services. Do you have the common permissions that those set for applications and services?
Yeah, so a lot of them, so like the exchange ones we were talking about specifically, right? They have the ability to modify permissions, right? So even if I can't directly modify the group, I can modify the ACLs.
Okay.
Also, take ownership is a
Okay.
big one. So there's a lot of those secret ACLs that most admins not might not be paying close attention to. We really want to focus on ACLs with more than read, I would say,
Okay. Awesome.
in the organization. But it's not just Active Directory and the OUs, we also need to extend this into things that consume Active Directory, like Active Directory certificate services, right? Those have been an area of focus as well. So you're definitely, hitting right on the head in regards to these are some of the key areas. Maybe even extend this into looking at the permissions of some of our group policies. And you mentioned DSACLs, great command to use. One of the ones that I've been using from, is PowerShell. But even if you don't know PowerShell, with AI advancement, right, you can do a lot of things around using AI to help identify some of these key areas in your organization. You could, have help AI help you write a PowerShell to explore some of these, or even write the command that Derek
Yeah.
mentioned
Yeah.
of how to use DSACLs in a more effective manner if you're
Yeah.
just starting out in your career. Now, if you're a PowerShell guru, you're probably not going to need that.
Yeah.
Everybody might not be at the same level
Yeah.
that we're
Now,
speaking to
before we move
today.
away from DSACLs, I want you to use DSACLs on admin SD holder. Okay. So make sure you look at admin SD holder is a default object that controls your default administrative objects like domain admins, enterprise admins, and whatnot. So go look at that particular object as well. You also want to look at the root. So this is where your shadow attacks come in, right? So go look at the root domain and you want to look at the permissions around the root domain as well. As Craig was saying, you want to look at your group policy objects and you want to look at the permissions of your group policy objects. The best thing that I can recommend here is go and create a default GPO and look at what the default group policy object permissions are as kind of a baseline, and then compare that to your other GPOs. That way you can kind of compare the default to what you have. I was a GPO MVP for years, and when you start getting into group policy and mucking with GPO defaults, you're just creating a world of hell for yourself. So stay away from it. Okay. And permissions are one of those things. And so if you have permissions that are modified for GPOs, usually that's a bad thing because your GPOs now may not be applying. So if you have modified permissions of GPOs, that might mean that you have some things that are gone askew. And so I would actually be concerned if you have GPO permissions that are modified. So I would go look at those just to make sure that things are in alignment around that. I would
Excellent
also,
advice around creating the default GPO,
yeah,
because now you do have that baseline, and that's a lot of IT admins might not think of that. They're like, okay, well, I dumped all these permissions, they seem okay to me, but they never knew what the baseline is to
yeah,
begin with. So excellent advice there.
yeah. And then I would look for SPNs, right? Service principal names. I always look at service principal names primarily because most organizations need them, right? So you go into your users, right? And this is where PowerShell comes in, right? And I'm sure Craig has them, I have them. Email both of us or one of us, and we'd be more than happy to give you a PowerShell command to dump this out. It's super simple, but you want to dump out all the users that have SPNs, right? It's just an attribute, but the key is you want to dump out the users that have SPNs, and your concern are SPN users with privileges, okay? When you actually assign a user to be a service account, it has an SPN. It needs it, right? This is a Kerberos thing, but because it has an SPN, it has a flaw and it gives up information. It kind of pukes up information. And so now, because it gives up information, you can actually impersonate that account. And if it has privileges, this is that issue, right? So the idea is you do not want to give any service account privileges because of this flaw with Kerberos and SPN users. Of course, what do most service accounts need? privileges, right? So this is that issue. So this is why I always recommend service accounts need to have long, strong passwords. You're going to put them in a PAM. You're going to have the PAM control them. All of these controls around your service accounts, and you monitor them. You restrict where they can log in. You do all these additional things because of this, but you also need to document them. You need to know which accounts, where they should be logging in. You do all these additional things around them. So those are some good things that you can do immediately. And that's what I would recommend, before the weekend you do. That gives you some things to do before the weekend.
Excellent advice. Yeah, service accounts, we're going to have a deeper dive conversation on things you can do around hardening service accounts in some later episodes. But that's an excellent segue. Let's talk about the underbelly of Active Directory, right? The replication of Active Directory, which is critical. But there's some common attacks out there that are taking advantage of the underbelly of Active Directory, right? These things might not be well known to everyday admins or someone that's just starting out with an Active Directory around some of these things. So let's start with DC Shadow attack. Can you give us a little more background around what a DC Shadow attack looks like there?
Absolutely. So a DC Shadow attack is when someone has basically domain admin credentials. And really the whole purpose of the DC Shadow attack is they want to create persistence, right? They want to somehow create changes inside of Active Directory for future use, right? So they're going to make changes. They can do really any change that they want, right? They modify, delete virtually anything in Active Directory. And how they do it is they create a fake domain controller. And this fake domain controller can communicate with the real domain controllers to make these changes. I think really the purpose is to create this persistence in areas where I think most organizations aren't looking, right? And I think, most organizations are relying on their SOC to find things that are anomalies. And the SOC just really isn't, built to do that, especially around Active Directory.
Right. So one of the things that I often see and hear from is DC Shadow attacks, because they are replicating the signature of a domain controller or acting like a domain controller, they're often harder to detect unless you have specialized tooling to really see the differences between what I'll call the old DC promo or making it a domain controller versus being a rogue domain controller. So it's a little more stealthier. And another challenge with the DC Shadow attack isn't just them registering the rogue domain controller itself, it's really the aftermath. So maybe can you talk about some attack or some methods that are done as part of that DC Shadow attack? So maybe some backdooring, like you mentioned, or maybe some additional persistence that organizations should look for as part of that attack?
Yeah, I think it's, the common things that the attackers want to leverage, right? So they may go in and create like primary group ID that's attackable for an account, right? A privileged ID. They may put in a SID history into an account to where now that account has a SID history that's a domain admin or an enterprise admin. Things that really no one is looking for, right? If I've never done a migration, why in the world would I think that I have a SID history on an account? I may inject an SPN into an account that isn't a service account, right? And so why in the world would I think that an account that isn't a service account has an SPN? I may put in unrestrained Kerberos delegation for an account that really would never have that setting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create settings that are attackable, that are breachable, that really no one is looking for. And certainly my SOC isn't going to look for these settings. And I'm not going to make obvious settings. I'm not going to put someone in the domain admins. I mean, that's just way too obvious, right? I'm not going to do the obvious things. And I think that's really the key here. When I've dealt with a lot of auditors, and the auditors go for the lowest hanging fruit. Oh, let's go look for the built-in groups and who has membership. Now, I'm not saying ignore that. Certainly look for that. But the attackers aren't going to go for the easiest settings. They're going to go for the settings that no one is looking for. And I think that's really what the DC Shadow attack is aiming for, is they're going to make the persistence around these settings that are really difficult to see. And I think it might also be, Active Directory permissions, right? It may be settings that people are never going to look for.
That's a good point. And you mentioned, you talked about that SID history injection, and previously we discussed having these obsolete SIDs in the environment that can actually be used from the shadow permissions in at the next step in that SID history injection. So that's a really good way of kind of bringing that to a close. And as you mentioned as well, SOCs teams, they're not really trained specifically unless they have tools built for that. To really see some of these other more advanced techniques that just look like everyday normal activity, right? So how do you really understand if this is nefarious or, hey, this is something that we should allow? Maybe our administrator is making this change for, X, Y, and Z reason in an organization.
Yeah,
Great summary.
You either have to have a SOC analyst that maybe used to be related to AD, or you'd have to have an AD administrator that's helping the SOC team develop, SIM rules in back and forth in order to create the rules inside of the SIM to help with that. One of the two, because SIMs don't come along with these type of rules to help with Active Directory settings at all.
No, yeah, I agree. So let's sticking with the underbelly of Active Directory, which we were really talking about, right? So when we're saying the underbelly, if you recall, we were talking about replication. So DC Shadow obviously plays a role into that, but there's another attack that's pretty well known, pretty abused by threat actors called DC Sync. So can you give us some background on what DC Sync is and what we need to look for in regards to this attack as well?
Yeah, so DC Sync doesn't actually require the domain admin credentials. So DC Sync are permissions at the root of the domain. And so there are two settings, which are basically the replication. It's the ability to replicate. And so it's similar in that you're going to use Mimikatz, and you're going to basically create the environment of another domain controller, and it's going to ask to replicate information from a real domain controller. And now you're going to replicate the account and the hashes from a real domain controller to this fake domain controller. And it only requires a couple of permissions. So I highly encourage that everyone go and look for these permissions at the root of the domain. It's not common for users to have these permissions at the root of the domain. So use DSACLs to go pull these permissions out and verify who has these permissions. Again, someone could use a DC Shadow attack and give themselves these permissions for this persistence to be able to pull the hashes out for accounts for later to be able to take these hashes offline, right? Offline is the key here, and crack the hashes offline to get the passwords for all of the accounts in order to get back in at a later date.
So those permissions that you're referring to at the root of Active Directory, DS replicate get changes and DS replicate get changes all,
yep.
Those are common though within Active Directory, especially in a hybrid environment because of the MSOL account. So that account is used, right, to replicate those changes to Entra ID and is needed, do not get me wrong there. But
right.
Other accounts typically shouldn't have that unless they're performing a similar function in your organization. Interesting topic. Because that account is so widely known, one of the things, and the permissions that it has inside of Active Directory and it can perform this DC Sync attack, you really need to make sure that, in a previous attack, someone didn't create a fake MSOL account and grant those rights as well. So that I just want to kind of call that out as well. But that's an interesting story in regards to just two permissions inside of Active Directory can allow me to replicate pretty much the password hashes offline, use brute forcing techniques, and especially with modern day technology, it's going to be much faster. Absolutely. And as we get into quantum, it's only going to get worse, right? So definitely I see bigger challenges there.
And I think you have a great point there. You have to know your service accounts, right? And I'm going to say that MSOL account is a service account, right? It is an account that is performing as a service. And so you have to have these things documented. And so you have to know what your accounts are. And so these things need to be documented, and you have to regularly dump these things out. And when I say dump them out, use DSACLs, dump them out, do comparisons to make sure that the right users, the right groups of users are listed for these ACLs, to make sure that everything is true on these Active Directory ACLs and permissions, so that there's no drift and no one is injecting something in there maliciously. Drift is going to happen, but we want to make sure that things are held pretty tight. And it actually, if you do it on a regular basis, some of these things can be pretty quick checks in order to make sure that there's no drift.
Yeah, and this one, because it's pretty well known and it's widely used by ransomware groups and threat actors. If you recall, this was even used by Lapsus to go after one of the dev environments in Microsoft a few years back. But I'm sure you could probably recall even newer ones that are abusing this technique. And really, DC Sync kind of, because of the permissions, leads back to what we were talking about earlier. These are shadow admin accounts inside of an organization with those shadow permissions. So I think this will really help our listeners understand, the threats behind the shadow permissions, as well as DC Shadow and DC Sync. And you covered several others throughout the session as well. So anything else that we would want to kind of leave with our listeners in regards to these two particular attacks?
I think the key is, and I think you nailed it, right? DC Sync is nothing more than an example of a shadow permission, right? It's nothing more than one example of that, where a DC Shadow is a little bit different, right? DC Shadow is not that level. It is a domain admin attack. So they're a little bit different. I know they seem similar, but they are a little bit different in their capabilities and the level of attack that they are. So what I would highly recommend is that you look for DC Sync configurations on a more regular basis, and you try to set up your SIM to look for these signatures, so that you're helping your SOC out a little bit to look for these signatures. I don't think that most organizations are going to be attacked with these, but you want to have your SOC prepared just in case you do have these types of attacks, so that you can detect them as soon as possible if you happen to have a breach and you have these attacks.
Yeah, and from DC Shadow, again, right, because it's so hard to kind of detect, you need specialized tooling. So things like Microsoft Defender for identity might play a real good role here for our audience, or any other solutions that they may be using that has this capability. But just kind of keep in mind, even with those tooling in place, you really need to be aware of these other avenues that could then follow further into persistence and backdooring, as Derek mentioned. But yeah, this has been helpful. Hopefully for our listeners, it was a good refresher for me as well, Derek. Any of the last remaining remarks that you want to share with the audience? I mean, obviously you've been around for a very long time, and MV 20 plus. And
yeah, 20. I just got my 20th in July. Quite a milestone.
Yeah, congrats on that.
I'm old. I'm old.
That's I'm not as young as I used to be. Either, so.
Just at least do one. At least do one thing. I find that administrators say I don't have time and I'm too busy. Run one PowerShell command and get a list. Be aware of what you have. Craig mentioned a couple of times, AD is hard. AD is complex. There's no question. But you have to be aware of where you're at risk. You have to be aware of what settings you actually have, because any user in your environment can run these PowerShell commands, and they can know what you should know. And these settings can hurt you because those users can take advantage of these settings. So please do at least one. I suggest you do them all. You can do them in 2 weeks. You can do all these settings. You can know all your environment. It's that simple. So at least do one. Start somewhere. That's my recommendation.
Great advice. Start somewhere. And that is true. You're thinking about it. You're like, okay, where do I start? Like, just pick an area that you want to go after and try to reduce that and shrink that attack surface and then move to the next one. So great
Yep.
advice. Thanks for joining. It's been a pleasure speaking with you again. Obviously, we have previous experience working together. Obviously, I follow you on LinkedIn. We follow probably the same circle in the cybersecurity as well. But it was a pleasure. And maybe we can have you back on and talk through some other areas of even how you have to worry about now, not just Active Directory, but maybe even Entra ID, if maybe you want to share some of that
That'd
in
be
the
great.
future. I'd love to have you back.
It'd be a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode of Guardians of the Directory, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. This includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Until next time, stay guarded, stay informed, and be the guardian of your directory.